Hi everyone, so I'm just about to wrap up my day 1 here of Season 9. I've been blasting pretty hard, I'm hardcore, almost SSF, to 221 Paragon, and I had an absolute blast here with my Spiritborn. So I want to talk a little bit about especially the new Thorns Poison builds that I think a lot of people are playing. I got 1,000 questions about those while I was streaming, and I hope that maybe with like a little bit of an FAQ here, I can help out a lot of people at once, because people seem to be unsure about what to do sometimes, or for example, what is the difference between some of those builds. So I already have a video talking about the setup and how it works. It is largely the same between those 4 builds, but well, Spiritborn is at the top. Spiritborn is really powerful with this setup, and there are some of those variants basically that are like 95% copy pasta basically. But well, let's jump into it. So what are the differences between those different setups? First of all, I want to highlight that we have the introduction here. So I wrote this and kind of gave them a bit of a role compared to the others. So you can also check that in written format. But the TLDR is I've been playing Rake. So I started with Evade for leveling, and then very soon, once I had the chest and the pants, I swapped to this setup basically. But I was freestyling a little bit because I didn't really have all the pieces. So now I'm playing the full build, and it's absolutely destroying like everything in Torment 4. I've been speed farming up to like 75 now or something, no problem at all. And I expect I'm gonna clear Pit 100 easy peasy tomorrow as well at some point. So this is how this is going right now. And with BALAZAN Rake, this has been really chill. So the main reason to play Rake is because it has built-in cooldown reduction. So this is part of the skill itself here. So this comes from this. You just reset your cooldown. So this is really good to get started. This is a really easy cooldown management. It's like very chill, especially for farming, for example. You don't really have to worry too much about, you know, pressing your buttons in the right order, trying to reset a hunter with a kill or with the wildfire glyph, for example, that allows you to get a cooldown reduction. So we have this here in some of the other setups, for example, that you use the hunter in a pack, and then it resets itself from the lucky hit of this glyph, basically. So that's kind of the idea. But Rake doesn't need that. So this is why Rake is really comfy, and why I would also recommend it as kind of like the overall probably best playable variant, let's say. So it just kind of like works early on, has a cooldown, feels comfy, and there's another advantage of Rake, which is that it gets the double cast with the Wild Claws aspect. So you actually proc the pants twice every attack, and while you don't have that many hits to, for example, trigger the Jaguar main haul, which is like the kind of main damage output that comes out of this later on, the double hit of the Rake does make up for that mostly. Then we have the BALAZAN Crush variant. So this is very similar to the Rake one, but it uses Crushing Hand. Crushing Hand has another perk, which is that it has barriers. So we have this here. When you hit enemies, you get up to 40% of your life as a barrier. This cannot be scaled with barrier generation, unfortunately, or at least not the maximum. So this is kind of what you get. But this is effectively very similar to what you would otherwise gain, for example, from the Bulwark. So many Spiritborn builds out there run the Bulwark rune here to get the Viscous Shield synergy and just for general survivability. This is relatively important on just about any Spiritborn build, including those BALAZAN variants. And Crushing Hand suddenly doesn't need a Bulwark, so you get a free rune setup. So it doesn't have the advantages of Rake with the cooldown resets, and instead you have this. So you can now use your free rune setup to do pretty much whatever you want. So you can actually get really tanky, most importantly, because you can generate barrier very easily by just spamming your main ability all the time. So you can just, you know, constantly generate 40% life as barrier as you pump out your attacks like 3 times per second. Like nothing can really kill you, and as long as it doesn't one-shot you, basically. This is Crushing Hand, and just really tanky, really comfy, especially hardcore wise, very good. And you get another rune setup where then you can get even more defense if you want. There are a bunch of good runes that you can throw in there, because now you have a free choice here. So you could do something like Dark Shrouds, for example, if you want to do lair bosses on T4, for example, and you feel like sometimes you get one-tapped and you don't like that, you can probably survive it if you have those Dark Shrouds. Or you can do just Exile, which is a bit more consistent for extra life, or something like that. Or for extra damage, you can also do something like Ohm, Fool. There's a bunch of options here that all make sense. Or, for example, even Zac to get your ultimate cooldown. So you also make the cooldown management a little bit more bearable, for example. Then we have BALAZAN Quill here. So BALAZAN Quill is potentially pushing the highest because it seems to have the highest single target damage, and that is kind of important for especially like, you know, pit, you know, 110, 120 or something like that. At some point the boss will be the bottleneck and you need to have the most boss damage, and Quill is probably doing that best. That being said though, we do expect that all of these 4 variants, well, this is why they're here at the top, will push higher than basically anything else in the game, with maybe a few pit tiers between them basically, which is kind of like hard to say right now without really a lot of data, and we might even tweak some of the setups and so on. But overall, they are all really good and very close to each other when it comes to the overall performance. But yeah, Quill will probably do that the best. And other than that, it also just is kind of like a old school, you know, very established playstyle. Quill Volley is kind of like the spur-born thing, and this is also why it's there. It also has insane amounts of lucky hit. It triggers the Jaguar Hall a lot, and it mostly has the disadvantage that it needs a lot of positioning. So Quill Volley has like this shotgunning effect, and you need to try to stand exactly on the target and then hit them, you know, right in their face basically with all the quills, and then they come back again from the rebounding aspect. So this is what Quill Volley is about mostly, where, for example, Crushing Hand, you just walk in the middle, you don't care where you stand, and you're tanky as well. And Rake, it's like a little bit like in between, let's say. You have to have some sort of positioning, but it's not really that crazy, and it has this really comfy cooldown effect. And then we have Thrash. So Thrash is actually kind of like a really nice starter variant, I would say, because it doesn't have any resource issues. So all the others here actually need to manage their resources somehow, which I'm going to go into in a second. And Thrash is a basic attack, so you just get resources while using it. So that is really comfy, and this is the main reason to run it. And on top of this, it also doesn't have to rely on the Ahu rune, which I actually don't have right now. So this is this one here, the lucky hit to generate offering when enemies are not healthy. So this has especially the downside that when you have a single target boss, like a lair boss or a high pit boss or something, this will not trigger in the first 20% of the fight, not giving you the quacks, which is a very important damage multiplier on this build. So the other 3 core skill variants all have this Ahu Quacks combo. Technically, you can do some other setups, something like Neo Quacks or maybe something else as well. So there are other ways to trigger it and have it up, you know, throughout the entire fight. But usually you go the Ahu route because it just triggers by far the fastest once you get there to the 80%. Or if you have ads on the boss, if you're doing a pit push, for example, then you will really notice that if there's like a Spirit Caller or Frost, you spawn ads, suddenly you get the Ahu procs, and then the Quacks kicks in, and the first 20% of the boss happen really quickly, and suddenly you have the whole engine going, basically. So Thrash doesn't have that downside because it can use the Moni rune. So you don't have like crazy scaling with density and with the lucky hits, but it is very consistent and just like every few seconds gives you this Quacks proc, at least if you manually activate it. The thing is that this cannot be triggered from basic or defensive skills, so you actually have to press like the Hunter, for example, or something like the Vortex, and then you manually trigger the Quacks. But you can do it at any point in the fight, and usually like every 2-3 seconds or so. So that's pretty much it for like the main differences between those variants. There's like a plus minus with the damage and so on, and all of those have their own little perks. So just the TLDR again, cooldown, this is really tanky, this is probably the best single target, and then this is kind of like the easy peasy starter and most consistent variant, and also has a little bit of cooldown effect. So this is kind of like how you can distinguish all of them. Now I should talk about the resources a little bit here. So I mentioned the Quacks rune, which constantly actually empties your entire resource bar. And I heard a lot of people asking me like, okay, what do I do now? I don't have resources, I can't attack. So this is obviously like much better to do when you actually have a really good setup. And if you're kind of starting out and you just found this rune there and you see it in a guide and you throw it in there, you might not really have the setup ready for this yet. So you can also just leave it out for the start. I've actually been playing without it as well. It's totally fine to go through Torment 4 content without the Quacks rune. If you feel like you're struggling with the resources, leave it out. And in fact, you could also do other things like the Lum rune. So really early on, I was actually running this here when I just did a swap because I had like absolutely nothing, and Lum rune just kind of helps you out. You can combine it with various other offering generation runes. If you have something like a Thumb, for example, that's very comfy, or you can even do something like a Seer. That is what I was doing. So every few seconds you just get a full restore from that. So there's various ways to do this, and like this you can spam your core skills much easier. And later, when you have the resources figured out, then you can introduce the quacks. So the way that you usually do the resource management is through the season power here, the reactive ooze. So this goes into basically all of those builds in order to get this insane resource generation. It's 20% baseline per second after pressing your skill, which you're gonna have all the time. This is a 10-second uptime, so permanently active effectively, easily. And like this, you actually fuel that quacks and your attacks later on as well. That being said, there is also a bit of a difference here between the 3 core skill variants, because they all spend their resources constantly, but Rake much less so than the other 2. And that is because of the Loyalty's Mantle. You get a up to 60% cost reduction for your Rake because you have Jaguar, and you have the Rake Jaguar skill. So in that case, my Rake actually just costs 12 or 13 instead of 30. And well, the other skills cost 30 and 35 respectively, so they will be at full value no matter what, because all of the builds have the Jaguar combo here with the Loyalty's Mantle, but the other skills don't profit from the cost reduction. So again, another good argument to play Rake, for example. So this is also partly why I chose it, but I was actually not running with the Loyalty Helm for a long time, and I still made it work, no problem. So it is possible, and this also means it's quite possible for the other setups here. And I didn't have a Starter Skies. But usually the Starter Skies later on actually takes care of this. So when you go in there, for example here, you get a 50% cost reduction. So Starter Skies makes everything a lot easier, and also, for example, ensures that whenever the quacks triggers, which is pretty often, you very quickly get to attack again. There's not really a gap where you don't attack because you're out of resources, because it costs so much less, even on Quill and on Thrash. Another part of the resource engine is also the quarter stuff here. I don't actually have this just yet, but you have the lucky hit chance to restore resources, so this is relatively important. Again, this helps you just with the consistency, with the uptime, especially when the Quacks rune triggers. But even before that, this is also another way to, for example, solve the resource management a little bit as well, together with like one of the other sources, like the reactive ooze from the season power, for example. So depending on what you have, you can do this or that. And then, you know, just kind of like slowly build towards this final setup where you have like all the power and you can go like pit 100 plus, no problem, basically. Then I got a bunch of other questions from people about how can I jump around from enemy to enemy all the time. So for those people that haven't played Spiritborn before, for example, this is coming from the Ravager. More importantly, this upgrade here to measure the Ravager. So you will see some of those setups that will actually choose the other version here, the replenishing. This is mostly to trigger the Jaguar Haul more often, so you get more hits, triggering this effect here more often, and then you have more damage output. But well, for speed farming, this is kind of overkill, and instead you can do this and you can go really fast. This is actually what we have in those speed farming variants as well. So at least for the core skill variants, this only works with cores, not with Thrash, for example. Like this, you jump from enemy to enemy, and you also get more resources, so this also helps you out a little bit. Then I also got a bunch of people asking what is exactly the items when you can do the switch. For example, you start evade and then you go to this build. I think I mentioned this, but basically you need the pants. They are the core of the build. You cannot play without them, and you really want to have the Razor Blade. Technically, it is possible to play without this, but this gives you kind of like this big boost of thorns, and without it, you're going to do like maybe a third of the damage, or even that. So you kind of want to have that thing here. The Loyalty's Mantle is actually somewhat optional, I would say, early on. So if you're like somewhere in Torment 2, Torment 3, just progressing, for example, Paragon 100 or something. I was actually running without this for the longest time, and I recently got a good roll, and then I finally managed to fix my armor and my resistances and stuff. It was kind of a struggle, especially playing on hardcore. I have to be mindful about that, and I actually just had a helm here with like, you know, double resistance and armor roll, and that kind of like solved all my issues. And later on with higher Paragon, you know, get a lot of armor and res here from all over the place. Then you can actually slowly replace these kind of things. So this is what I did, and then I actually swapped over here. And another question I keep getting is about the infusions here from the season power. So for example, people ask me like, why are we running this infusion, or why are we running the poison infusion? So the way this works is, as you can see on the tooltip as well in the second paragraph, it will set the same element of the infusion to the highest value of another element that you have. So in most cases, we have a wildfire glyph that I have shown earlier in the setups here. Rake, for example, doesn't need it, but the other builds, they all run the wildfire glyph, giving you some extra fire damage. And now you can convert this fire damage from the wildfire glyph to poison damage by using this poison infusion. So you have to put this one, but Rake, for example, doesn't need it. Rake doesn't run the wildfire glyph, so you can use basically whatever you want here, and then you're fine. And that's also pretty much for what I got to share here for now. So hope it helps you out. Wish you good luck with the Spiritborn in Season 9. Let me know what you think about the builds. If you have feedback or whatever, you can also come to my stream, talk about it. So that is the easiest because I'm blasting all day long. But for now, I'll be exploring this more. And well, let's see how far we can actually push with the new pit scaling and with the character that I made here. So I'm quite excited for that. Hope you liked this video, and I'll see you guys next time.